You are likely going to spend an astonishing number of hours pulling weeds this year. Not once, not twice, but over and over again from the exact same spots in your yard. The worst part is that 2 weeks after all that effort, many of those weeds will be back as if nothing happened. That is exactly why this video matters. These 9 ground covers can reduce that endless cycle almost to zero by replacing bare, exposed soil with dense living coverage that weeds struggle to penetrate. Before we go further, comment your state right now, because your USDA zone changes everything. The fastest ground cover in Florida is not always the fastest one in Michigan, and the best performer in dry Colorado sun may fail in a shaded yard in Pennsylvania. Throughout this video, I'll keep calling out zones so you can match the right plant to the exact conditions in your own yard. And stay with me to the end, because one plant on this list solves the single hardest weed problem most American gardeners eventually give up on completely: the dry shade under mature trees. That spot where grass fails, mulch disappears, and weeds somehow still win. Let's start with plant number 1, creeping thyme. Every bare patch of soil in your yard is an invitation. It is open space, sunlight, and opportunity all rolled into one, and weeds are built to take advantage of exactly that. Creeping thyme changes the rules by covering the soil with a dense, low-growing mat that blocks many weed seeds from ever getting the conditions they need to germinate. As it spreads, creeping thyme forms an interlocking carpet of stems and tiny leaves. That coverage lowers light at the soil surface, moderates temperature, and makes it much harder for weed seedlings to break through. Once it is established, it does not just sit there looking pretty. It actively occupies space that weeds would otherwise use. For most gardeners in USDA zones 4 through 9, creeping thyme is a strong long-term option. In colder zones, it handles winter impressively well. In warmer zones, it becomes especially valuable because once established, it tolerates dry conditions that often weaken other ground covers by late summer. There are several varieties worth knowing. Elfin thyme stays compact and neat, making it ideal between stepping stones or in tight spaces. Pink chintz thyme gives you soft pink flowers and a more ornamental look for visible beds. Red creeping thyme spreads a bit faster and brings stronger magenta color, which makes it useful for larger areas where coverage speed matters. One of the most surprising things about creeping thyme is that it often performs better in lean, poor soil than in rich, heavily amended beds. Most gardeners assume every planting area needs improvement before planting, but thyme often prefers the opposite. Too much fertility can make it looser and less effective. In tougher soil, it tends to stay lower, tighter, and more weed-suppressing, and that is where it starts to outperform bark mulch in a very practical way. Mulch has to be bought, spread, refreshed, and replaced. It breaks down, shifts, and still allows weeds through. Creeping thyme is a one-time planting that becomes more effective with each season. Instead of covering the ground temporarily, it transforms what the ground allows to grow. Here at Evergreen Home, the goal is simple: help you build a yard that demands less money, less labor, and far fewer weekends spent doing the same exhausting tasks. And that brings us to plant number 2, white clover. White clover does something most weed-suppressing plants do not. It improves the soil while it covers it. Through its root nodules, it helps fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into the ground, which means the space it occupies is not just protected from weeds, but gradually enriched as well. For generations, white clover was considered useful in American landscapes. Later, it was rebranded as a problem, and many gardeners were taught to remove it without ever realizing it had been helping them all along. It spreads quickly, stays resilient, and works across an enormous range from USDA zones 3 through 10. So here is the question. Were you taught that clover was a weed, or were you taught that it was working for you? Plant number 3 is creeping jenny. If speed matters to you, This is one of the most important plants in the entire list. Creeping jenny spreads with unusual aggressiveness, especially in the exact type of conditions that defeat many other weed-suppressing ground covers: moist soil and partial to fairly deep shade. Instead of slowly widening from one central clump, creeping jenny roots at each node where stems touch the soil. That means every bit of spread can become a new starting point, and every new starting point creates still more spread. The result is not simple expansion. It is compounding coverage. That is why bare ground disappears so quickly under creeping jenny. You are not waiting for one plant to get larger year after year. You are watching a network form in multiple directions at once. In practical terms, that means many shady trouble spots begin to look intentionally covered rather than patchy and defeated. The golden forms of creeping jenny are especially useful in darker areas because the foliage has a vivid chartreuse tone that seems to brighten the space. Under trees, along north-facing walls, or in beds that never get enough sun for grass to look decent, creeping jenny can make the area look designed instead of neglected. And because it performs best in USDA zones 3 through 9, it works in a very broad range of American gardens. In hotter parts of that range, especially zones 7 through 9, it is best to protect it from harsh afternoon sun. But in the partial shade conditions where so many other plants thin out, creeping jenny often does the opposite. It fills in, locks down the soil, and keeps weeds from getting the head start they usually rely on. This is also where many gardeners realize something important. Most people try to solve their worst weed problems with repeated effort: more mulch, more pulling, more spraying, more frustration. But the smarter answer is often not more effort. It is the right plant in the right place. And that leads naturally into the mid-video reminder. If you are watching this and realizing how many hours you have already spent this season pulling the same weeds from the same areas, that is exactly why Evergreen Home exists. This channel is built around practical gardening advice for real American yards, real climate zones, and real maintenance problems. The purpose is not to give you more chores. It is to help you permanently remove them. Plant number 4 is Ajuga, also called bugleweed. Ajuga is one of the most effective mat-forming ground covers you can use for weed suppression because of the way it spreads. It sends out runners in multiple directions and creates a dense, low surface that blocks light from reaching the soil. Weed seeds are not simply discouraged under Ajuga. Many of them never get the light and space they need to start at all. That is why Ajuga has such a long practical history in formal gardens. Long before modern herbicides and landscaping fabrics, people valued plants that could occupy space so thoroughly that weeds stopped being a weekly job. Ajuga belongs in that category. There are several standout varieties. Black Scallop offers dramatic, deep foliage that is nearly black in the right light, making it useful in front yard beds where appearance matters. Burgundy Glow has pink, cream, and burgundy tones that make it look almost designed by a professional. Catlin's Giant is larger, bolder, and useful where you want coverage with a stronger visual presence. Ajuga performs especially well in USDA zones 3 through 9 and often thrives in moderate shade, including those difficult fence line strips and edges of beds where weeds keep returning no matter how often you clear them. Once established, Ajuga stops that cycle by taking the space for itself. That is the real pattern of this video so far. Every strong ground cover removes opportunity from weeds by removing the empty ground weeds depend on. Plant number 5 is sweet woodruff. This is one of those plants that feels almost old-fashioned in the best possible way. For centuries in Europe, sweet woodruff was valued for multiple household uses. It was appreciated for fragrance, for its delicate appearance, and for the way it quietly filled shaded spaces with very little attention. That same quiet strength is what makes it so useful today. Sweet woodruff spreads by rhizomes, which allows it to move through soil conditions that stop many other plants cold. If you have a dry, shaded area beneath mature trees, or a place with compacted soil where grass never truly establishes, sweet woodruff is one of the smartest plants you can use. It was practically made for those difficult conditions. As it spreads, it forms a soft, low carpet of foliage, topped in spring by small, white, star-shaped flowers. That gives it a rare advantage. It is not just functional, it is ornamental, too. It solves a problem while still making the space look intentional and attractive. In USDA zones 3 through 8, sweet woodruff is a dependable choice, especially across regions where established suburban trees create root-heavy shade and constant competition for moisture. In hotter parts of its range, it may slow down in peak summer heat, but it generally returns with strength when temperatures moderate again. The most important point is this. Sweet woodruff is not simply another thing to try under trees. It is one of the few plants that actually prefers the conditions most gardeners are trying to escape. That means you are no longer fighting the site. You are matching the site. And if you know someone who spends weekend after weekend weeding those same impossible shaded spots, this is exactly the kind of solution worth sharing. A plant like this does not just save effort once, it changes what that area of the yard requires year after year. Plant number 6 is Sedum, also known as stonecrop. If sweet woodruff is the answer to dry shade, Sedum is the answer to the opposite problem: relentless sun, poor soil, heat, and drought. This is one of the toughest ground covers you can grow, and that toughness is exactly what makes it such an effective weed suppressor in the hardest hot weather locations. Sedum stores water in its leaves, which means it is not relying on constant irrigation, rich soil, or ideal care to survive. In fact, too much pampering often makes it perform worse. It prefers lean, well-drained, even neglected soil. That is important, because many of the worst weed patches in American yards are not in perfect garden beds. They are on dry slopes, beside driveways, along sidewalks, or in baked areas where other plants fail by August. This is where Sedum excels. In USDA zones 3 through 9, it provides dependable coverage across a wide climate range. In zones 6 through 9 especially, it becomes extremely valuable because it keeps performing long after many competing weeds and ornamental plants have burned out under summer stress. There is also a long practical history behind plants like Sedum. For generations, Sedum-type plantings were used in extremely exposed places precisely because they could survive with almost no help. That lesson still applies today. If a plant can thrive where water is limited and the soil is poor, it can take over the exact spaces weeds often exploit once everything else gives up. Another thing that makes Sedum so useful is that it often looks better in bad soil than in good soil. Rich, heavily amended beds can make it flop or stretch. Tougher, poorer ground keeps it compact, tighter, and more effective at covering the surface. So if you have a dry slope, a thin strip by pavement, or a sun-baked patch you are tired of rescuing every summer, Sedum may be the point where you stop trying to improve the spot and instead finally plant something that actually wants to be there. Plant number 7 is Pachysandra. If you have ever looked at a commercial landscape under mature trees and wondered why it still looks covered year after year with so little visible maintenance, there is a good chance Pachysandra is part of the answer. This plant is widely used because it creates one of the most dependable evergreen weed barriers available for shaded areas. That evergreen quality matters more than many gardeners realize. Some ground covers do a decent job in spring and summer, but leave soil exposed in colder months or during transition periods. Pachysandra is valuable because it keeps the ground covered continuously. That means fewer seasonal gaps when early weeds can get started before your planting wakes up again. It spreads through underground stems, gradually building a thick root network and a unified surface layer. Once that network is established, the planting area often shifts from a place that constantly needs intervention into one that mostly needs to be left alone. That is exactly the kind of trade most gardeners want. Less seasonal spending, less repeated labor, and far less bending over the same patch of ground. Pachysandra performs especially well in USDA zones 4 through 8, with some of its best results showing up under deciduous trees where shade is consistent and the soil remains relatively stable. In those classic suburban trouble spots, where grass refuses to stay full and mulch has to be reapplied every year, Pachysandra often becomes the more permanent answer. It also changes the economics of maintenance. A heavily shaded bed under trees can become a repeated expense if you keep relying on mulch and cleanup alone. Pachysandra shifts that model. Instead of buying coverage every season, you plant coverage once and let it strengthen over time. That is what makes it so valuable for people who want a yard that becomes easier instead of more demanding as the years go by. And that is a big part of what Evergreen Home is about. The goal is not just to recommend plants that survive, it is to recommend plants that reduce recurring effort in real, measurable ways. Plant number 8 is Vinca minor, also known as periwinkle. This plant has been present in American gardens for generations, and that staying power says a lot. Garden trends change constantly. Plants fall in and out of fashion, but the ones that keep surviving across decades usually do so for a simple reason. They solve real problems reliably. Vinca minor is one of the most attractive weed-suppressing ground covers on this list because it offers both evergreen coverage and spring flowers. Its glossy dark green leaves create a thick mat across the soil, while the blue-violet blooms give it genuine ornamental value. So unlike some purely functional ground covers, Vinca minor earns its place visually as well as practically. It is especially effective on slopes, banks, and shaded or partly shaded areas where mowing is inconvenient and bare soil tends to invite weed pressure. Once it starts rooting along its runners and forming an interlocked surface, the difference becomes obvious. Instead of scattered patches and open space, you get continuity. In USDA zones 4 through 9, Vinca minor can be a strong long-term performer. It tolerates shade, moderate drought, and root competition from older trees better than many softer, less established options. That makes it appealing for people who want one planting to handle several challenges at once. There is, however, one important point of honesty. In some states, especially near woodland edges, Vinca minor has naturalized beyond garden beds. So if your property borders wild areas, it is smart to check local guidance before planting. But in contained landscape beds away from natural areas, it remains one of the most useful combinations of beauty, persistence, and weed suppression available. By this point in the video, one pattern should be clear. The best ground covers are not just pretty fillers. They are replacements for recurring labor. Plant number 9 is not just one plant. It is a 2-layer ground cover system, sweet woodruff and wild ginger together. And this matters because the worst weed problem in many American yards is not full sun, not a front border, not even a slope. It is that dry, root-filled, deeply shaded area under older trees where almost nothing seems to hold. Grass fails, mulch thins out, and weeds still manage to appear anyway. Most gardeners eventually accept that area as a permanent loss. But this combination changes that. Sweet woodruff moves through the upper layer quickly, spreading across the surface and covering exposed soil. Wild ginger works more slowly, but it anchors deeper and creates broad, overlapping leaves close to the ground. Together, they do what a single plant often cannot. One fills the upper visual layer, while the other strengthens the lower structural layer. The result is a more complete barrier, above and below, where weeds struggle to find either light or open ground. That is what makes this pairing so powerful. It is not simply decorative layering. It is functional weed suppression built in 2 tiers. Wild ginger is especially valuable because it evolved in woodland conditions and is naturally suited to the Eastern American shade garden environment. Its leaves create a low canopy at soil level, and once established, That leaf cover shuts down much of the open germination space weeds need. Paired with sweet woodruff, which moves more quickly across the top layer, the system becomes stronger over time instead of weaker. Across USDA zones 3 through 7, this combination can solve one of the most exhausting maintenance problems in a yard. Not instantly, but permanently enough that after establishment, you are no longer repeating the same losing battle every season. And that leads to the 3 most important principles in the entire video. First, planting density matters. Ground coverers only suppress weeds when they close space quickly. If you plant too sparsely, weeds simply move into the gaps before the ground cover can take control. Dense planting costs a little more up front, but it saves a great deal of labor later. Second, the establishment window matters. Even the best ground cover needs time to root, spread, and lock down the soil. During those first months, you still need to keep the area protected and reasonably clear. That early attention is not a failure of the system. It is what allows the system to become low maintenance afterward. Third, edge maintenance matters. Once a ground cover is established, the real ongoing task is usually not interior weeding. It is boundary control. Clean edges along paths, lawns, and bed lines make the planting look intentional and keep the entire system neat, controlled, and effective. And that is really the big promise of this whole video. Not that your yard will never need another minute of care, but that the care becomes smarter, smaller, and far less repetitive. Instead of fighting the same patch of ground every 2 weeks, you plant once, manage the establishment period well, and let the right plants do the long-term work for you. That is exactly the kind of yard Evergreen Home is built to help you create. So now I want to hear from you. What is the single worst weed spot in your yard right now? The one you dread every time you look at it. Plant once, weed far less. And I'll see you in the next video. Drop your state and that problem spot in the comments, and I'll tell you which plant or which system from this list fits it best.